So this is where I live, and I'm in Milwaukee in a nice green season, as opposed to this winter season. That little green and white house, and you can see the bungalows there. Kind of looks like Tosa, right around 65th Street, where you guys live. Don't you have some of those small bungalows? Yeah. Mm-hmm. And we're over in River West. I've been there 27 years. And the reason we're over there is I came to Milwaukee after becoming a pastor. I served in Dayton, Ohio. I thought I was going to be a pastor in a city church there because my training was in urban ministry, and that's one of the reasons I was out in Boston, because when I was at Eau Claire, it took me 3 years to finally find a major I never used. And I was one of those kids that's at school and doesn't know what to do with their life. And it was very, very hard for me. I was really bothered not knowing what to do with my life. I grew up on a farm, and my generation is the first generation in my family history to not become farmers. Everybody that we know of before my dad and my grandfather, they were all farmers. So all of a sudden, you can be whatever you want in this world. What are you going to do? And I only had 4 kids in my high school class of 100 that went to college, so there wasn't a whole lot of thinking about going to do anything. You just got a job or something. But I went away to school, far, far away, 80 miles to Eau Claire. And it took me I went as a music major because I played trombone, and I thought I was going to be the lead trombonist on the Lawrence Welk show. You know, that's what or a band director, which after very few months, I'm like, no way. I don't know if you've met any band nerds at Eau Claire, but there's a bunch of them there. That is not me. All the jazz players. And I floundered because I had all these music credits after a year. What am I going to do? I took general ed for another year. What am I going to do? I finally got into social work because it was a path that I thought opened some doors. And along the way, I thought I want to be useful and I want to help people if I can. And so I guess you could say I've used my major, but at the time I had no clue. And ended up getting into... well, let's see, what can I do here? I'll try to draw this story together. But I was assigned to Ohio in order to serve an urban church, long story short, in terms of my professional ministry. And it wasn't ready to have a pastor, and so I ended up getting called into this great big suburban church as an assistant pastor. It's a church that's 2 or 3 times this church's size. And this is not a small church. This is actually a large church. But that one was really large. And that preceded me coming here. But when I came here, I planted a church in Milwaukee and actually ended up writing a book that got published. So if you want to read the story of me planting a church in the inner city at 2nd and Clark, if you know the Milwaukee area south of where I live in River West, this is it. It sits on that little bookshelf thing over there, that kiosk that's, you can borrow it, bring it back. It was interesting that the church publishing house, once I wrote the story of planting the church, wanted to publish it. So it's my big claim to fame. But this is where it started, on the farm, outside of La Crosse, Wisconsin, a little town called Holman, actually outside of Holman. And that's the childhood farm there when I was about probably 5, 6 years old. A little chicken that I was gently holding. And I couldn't see a thing. I've needed glasses since I was born because I was born cross-eyed and all this other stuff that they had to straighten out. And so I really can't see what's going on there very well, I'm sure. But Mom took the picture, and that's one that survives from back in the day. And I had this great experience growing up on the farm, Mom and Dad and 4 siblings. And in many ways it was storybook upbringing because, farm, right? There's so many good things about it. And my mom and dad married their whole life and together, and all 4 of my kids are successful in doing, or 4 of their kids and me are successful in doing good in life. And I often say, one of the great blessings of growing up on the farm is you learn how to work. And we learned how to work, and that's effective in life. By the time I was 16 years old and 17, I went to Eau Claire. It was they put you into school really early when I was a little kid. It was probably already in kindergarten by then, or first grade. And so I graduated, and I was 17 years old. I went to Eau Claire, I was 17 years old. That seems young, but turned 18 a few months into it, but weeks into it. But point is, you just, you were going along in life and finding your way. But we were just, you learned how to work and how to find what you needed to do in life to survive. But there was not it wasn't really storybook when you got behind the scenes of what was there. Even though my life was spared stuff like, there was no divorce, there was no abuse, stuff that I as a pastor encounter a lot in people's lives where there's deep scars and pain. There was no alcoholism in my family immediately. What happened in that age is being a child of the 60s. So I'm born in 58, and my brother's a year and a half older than me, and then 3 sisters came fairly quickly. It was the age of the 60s and 70s, what they used to call the generation gap. And try to make a long story short, as my family tried to process the stuff my brother and I were going through, this movie came out just about 5, 6, 7 years ago. And we don't go to a lot of movies, my wife Ann and I, but we went to this one. And afterwards, I was pretty profoundly affected by it. And she was like bored. And she wondered, why did this affect you? I said, Ann, that is basically the story of my high school life, which is young kids living in what they think is the spectacular now, doing stupid things and making decisions that impact the rest of their life because they have no grasp of a larger perspective and they had no grounding. Now, I had a fair amount of grounding in many ways, but I was surrounded by a lot of people that were not making great decisions, and I was not that far behind them. So I often feel like going 80 miles away to Eau Claire got me out of a lot of trouble and got me out of the bars, which a lot of my friends graduated into the bars because they had nothing else to do, get a job and go to Smokies, My family had no resources for dealing with this reality of the generation gap, because I told you earlier tonight that we never talked about faith. We had to go to church, but we never talked about what it meant and why. Ever. My mom spent 85 years on that farm. She was born on that farm and she died on that farm. She's a wonderful person, but I wouldn't have known at the time, but basically I know what she was going through when she was probably about 35, and that was, is this all that life is? Big old midlife crisis. It wasn't my dad that went through it, it was my mom. She didn't do anything stupid, but boy was she upset a lot. She was always upset about so many things. And so there's a lot of tension in the family, and we never talked about it. We never figured out how to solve our conflicts. We would have blow-ups and yelling, and we had no resources for dealing with it. And that kind of stuff resulted in some teenage rebellion and stuff. My brother, in my small town, the only thing mattered that was sports. If you were good at sports, you were worth something, and my brother was very, very good at sports. I liked sports. I just wasn't very good at them. I tried a lot of them, but I didn't have a whole lot of success. I was like this music dude, right? And the other thing I did was forensics. You know what that is? Speech making. I did 4-minute persuasive speeching. People wish my sermons were 4 minutes. But I actually did fairly well in that stuff, and nobody cared. Who cares if you're good at speaking and singing and playing a stupid trombone, but that's what I could do, and life was hard to try to figure out meaning and value, because my dad was a wonderful guy, but he was just a farmer who could not understand his talkative son, who had all these feelings and all this emotion stuff, and as I got to be, in public life, my dad admired, but we had no ability to relate, because he was a blue-collar farmer who was, I always thought of him as sort of John Wayne of the world, just really strong and good, but could not relate to him to me on a personal level. And so there was a lot of stuff that I had to work through, which, even though it took me a long time to try to find my way at Eau Claire, when I finally graduated not knowing what to do with my life, literally not knowing what to do next, I got all these friends getting married and going to places like Milwaukee and working at places like Johnson Control, you know, all these interviews, and I'm like, what am I going to do? Had my degree. While I was a church kid, they had sent us to a summer camp thing called Wilderness Canoe Base up in the Boundary Waters. I was probably 14 years old. I went on this Boundary Waters wilderness trip. And I remembered that place because part of my social work requirement was to work in a group home with adolescent, emotionally disturbed kids. And it was the chaplain for that place was a guy who was one of the founders of this Wilderness Canoe Base place that I had been to as a kid on a trip. And I decided on a lark to go ahead and apply to be a guide, a canoe guide in the wilderness, which I was accepted because it was an outward bound kind of camp and they worked with a lot of troubled kids. And they wanted people who knew how to work with emotionally disturbed kids. They thought I would have outdoor skills because I'm a farmer, but I had no camping skills. I'd never camped. They could teach you that. I was terrified going into the wilderness with a compass and having to guide these people because it was very obvious you can get lost out here. And you're out in the middle of nowhere with 10 people and you're responsible for them all. But that's what I did, and I went up there very intentionally with two things in my mind. So for much confusion as I was going through about what to do in my life, and literally depression. I was depressed about not knowing what to do in my life. I didn't realize it at the time I was depressed, but I know I was now. Because I did not want to wake up in the morning and face the next day. I had two remarkable amounts of clarity going to that camp. Number one, I was going to decide if I was going to work with people in need as a career. And number two, I was going to decide if I was going to do it from a God perspective. And how did I have that much clarity? Because before I went away from home and as a kid, the pastor of our church, which I had to go to every week, asked me to stop by his office. He said, before you go to college, stop by my office. I did finally, after weeks of him asking that. Sat at his office table, and he said, my wife teaches your high school Sunday school class. She thinks you have some good ideas. We think you might think about being a pastor someday. I'm like, what would that be? You know? He says, and then he said two more things. He said, not that you're perfect, because he knew that there was stuff going on in my life. And the second thing he said is, but I think farmers make good pastors. He had been a farmer. And what he meant by that is farmers know how to work. And they know how to not worry about hours. They know how to get stuff done. And they know how to run a ship, and, you know, if you're effective. And my dad was very effective, and thankfully he showed me some good stuff, which became useful if you're going to go into inner city by yourself and plant a church in a black community, which was a great joy in my life. So anyway, you can imagine what happened at that camp. I got, we studied one scripture in particular, and I taught on it for the whole summer, Romans 12:2. Don't be conformed to this world, but be transformed by having your mind renewed so that you will know the will of God. And I looked at all this stuff from this, spectacular now of my past and the conforming I was doing to all the stupid stuff around me. And I realized I was not supposed to be that. There was so much more I could do with my life that would be useful. And that this relationship with God that I was learning more about now as an adult, where you could actually talk to people about faith as opposed to just do it because you had to do it, was changing me. And there's always ups and downs in life, and I've had a lot for the last 45 years or whatever. But this amazing joy of living this life of faith that I have, and to be useful in the lives of people like you, hopefully your lives and others, that I get the privilege of being, not just planting a church among all these kids in the city and all that devastation, but now out here. I mean, it's good stuff. So that was me when I was 21 and a guide. And I still try to bring groups up there. So I was there again last summer. This is the same Palisades up over it's on a place called Seagull Lake up in the end of the Gunflint Trail. For those who remember Ham's Beer, this is where they shot those commercials, from the land of sky blue waters. Anyway, And then I was in the Eddy Falls up there this summer, just getting baptized again, So that's my story. That's my story. Shut that down. Any questions, comments before I tell you what we just did and why that I wanted you to experience that?